Today we're going to talk about two terms that you might have heard a little bit about, that you've come across, in contrasting quantitative and qualitative research, or Quant and Qual. And oftentimes you'll hear about these terms used almost religiously, and some fierce debates about which is better and which should be used. And I know I'm even guilty of that, being somebody who does primarily quantitative research. I've had some good arguments with my colleagues about which is better. But the reality, though, is that even though we throw around these terms pretty forcefully, it's really just about different ways or different cultures that are going to be used in order to respond to some of the really interesting puzzles in the social world. And I think both have things that are really unique that they offer to us as social scientists. So we're going to take a look at what I think is the best article that really lays out these two cultures, the Mahoney and Goertz article, A Tale of Two Cultures, Contrasting Quantitative and Qualitative Research. And what I'll try to do today is go through those 10 differences between the two different cultures, what they bring, what they add, so that you have a sense of those two. And at the same time, I'm going to go through two projects that I've actually done, one quantitative and one qualitative. And maybe I'll post both of them for you to read if you're interested. It was looking at very much the same subject matter, but taking two very different approaches. All right, so let's just go through the article. I'll just scroll through. You can read alongside me. I'm obviously not going to read it out loud, but you can take a look. So essentially, the beginning, the introduction, talks a lot about those two different cultures and some of the major works that have promulgated each of these types of inquiry or cultures of inquiry within the social sciences. And then it identifies 10 areas of contrast, and those are the 10 areas that we are going to look at in more detail. And there's a lovely little chart here to contrast them, bit of a cheat sheet to help you follow along. And so the first of these is the approaches to explanation. And so in all research, we are trying to explain things. We're trying to understand and explain the social world of human beings doing things within the world. Okay. So there's different ways of asking those really important questions, though, between the qualitative culture and the quantitative culture. So oftentimes what we'll say is in the qualitative world, we'll be looking more at a case or an outcome, and then we'll ask, well, why? What's the cause of that? Whereas in the quantitative world, we'll say, okay, what is the effect of a particular cause? To give an example from my research, I'm going to talk a little bit about referendums on electoral reform in Canada. So that's something that I've been really interested in. There were a number of provinces that held these referendums on whether they should change from a first-past-the-post or single-member plurality system to a mixed-member proportional system or a single transferable vote or whatnot. And in all of the cases, it failed in each of the provinces. And so a good qualitative question on that I would ask is, well, why did all of these Canadian provincial referendums on electoral reform fail? What was it? So I'm starting off with this failure that I notice, and I'm going to say, okay, well, what caused that? What led to all of these referendums to fail? A more quantitative approach that I've taken, though, was looking specifically at knowledge about electoral systems. So I had this theory that when you know more about electoral systems, you're going to be more likely to support a referendum on it because you actually have a better sense of what the pros and cons are, and you're going to be able to feel more likely to support something that's not the status quo. So then a good quantitative question that I've asked is, does more knowledge about electoral systems actually lead to greater support for reform? So we're still trying to tap at the same thing, is we've noticed that electoral reform seems to be this thing we always talk about in Canada, but never actually ends up happening. So why is that the case? And so these are two questions trying to get at that, but asking kind of different questions to get at that. So moving on, the second thing that Mahoney and Goertz say that can distinguish these two cultures is our conceptions of causation. And so what we're talking about here is essentially that in a qualitative route, we might think in terms of necessary or sufficient causes. So is a particular variable or is a particular thing really necessary to make this particular outcome? Or is there a sufficient reason why that outcome would happen? Whereas in a more quantitative, methodology, we'd be more interested in average causal effects. So in general, does this lead to that? So let's get back to our example. So for example, in my qualitative research on electoral reform, I would be asking, well, were there certain necessary or sufficient variables that would have led to or caused a referendum to fail? Something like having a threshold. I know in BC they had a larger threshold than just getting a majority of votes. Was it education campaigns? Was it political will or political capital? So I'm interested in knowing which of these is really necessary for a referendum to fail. Whereas in my quantitative work, I set up an experiment. So I gave half of these individuals a text about electoral reform, half of them got a text about, I think it was like photocopiers or something, like something super different that had nothing to do with electoral reform. And then I was looking on average, did the people who got more information, were they more likely to support electoral reform? So there, what I'm interested in is average causal effects. Obviously, I'm not interested in every single person. What did they say? But I want to know, on average, was the willingness to support electoral reform higher among those who got more information? And so in both of these, the causation or the relationship can be the same. It could be education can lead to more support. But the way that we're looking at the causality here is quite different. All right, so the third thing that Mahoney and Goertz talk about is multivariate explanations. And so what they explain, let's just move down to that. And right here, I think is really, this first paragraph is really helpful to explain it here, is the idea that in qualitative research, we can have this assumption that individual events do not have a cause, but there's going to be some causally relevant factors. So it's not just like one thing is going to lead to this, that probably there's some combination of these factors that is going to be sufficient or necessary to produce this outcome. Whereas in quantitative research, it's really assuming the average effects of one particular thing, and what we'll do then is we will control for other factors, and you'll definitely hear more about that as you continue studying. But the idea being that, to give the example from my research, in the qualitative approach, I might say that multiple paths could have happened to make a referendum fail. It doesn't have to be one. Maybe it's education, but in BC we see that the threshold might have been really important because it did get a majority of support, but not the supermajority. And so we'd be asking, okay, what's the right combination of factors that would lead to failure? Whereas when I'm doing my quantitative work, I'm interested on average in whether this particular path, so knowledge about electoral reform, leads to support or rejection of the proposal. So each individual can have their own path towards supporting or rejecting the proposal, and I acknowledge that through control variables. So the idea that maybe an important other factor would be formal education is going to affect these variables, maybe age or ideology. And so what I do is I include those in my statistical modelings, but really at the end of the day, I'm really interested in that independent variable, or this idea that knowledge is going to lead to support. And I want to know, despite there being a whole bunch of other factors in the world that could have some sort of influence, I really want to isolate down to that knowledge. And so I acknowledge those other factors, but in a different way than I would in a qualitative study. So moving on to number 4, so I'm mostly a quantitative researcher, and when I was first reading this article, I was like, what the heck is equifineity? I've never heard of this before. And then, of course, I laughed because I saw equifineity, where was it? Right here, that if you do like large and quantitative work, equifineity would not be part of one's methodological vocabulary. So that made me feel a little bit better. But to give an example from our examples, it's really related to this idea of equifinality, not equifineity. Equifinality is related to this idea that there can be multiple causal paths. So I'm curious to know why in BC did it fail? Why in Ontario did it fail? Why in PEI did it fail? And there might be multiple causal paths to that same outcome of failure. Yes, that's what it says right here, is that there can be multiple paths to the same outcome. Whereas in my quantitative research, it's not really something that I take into consideration. Of course, there's going to be multiple paths. We know that individuals are all different, but I'm not going to outline each of them because that's a lot of humans to go through. I'm interested on general, why did people support or reject based on their knowledge, not just why Samantha supported or rejected, or why John supported or rejected. I want to know the average causal effects, whereas in qualitative work, I will be interested in those multiple causal paths. All right, moving then to scope and generalization. So again, the first paragraph is pretty good at explaining this. So in qualitative research, we're going to probably have a smaller scope because we want to get kind of dig a little bit deeper into what's leading to a particular outcome, and that we'll recognize, because it is smaller in scope, that our inferences are generalizable only to a certain range of cases. Whereas when I'm doing more quantitative work, I am really interested in generalizing to as large a number of cases as possible. So to give an example, my study then on why electoral reform fails in Canada, I can't necessarily say based on that why it ended up passing in New Zealand. I have to limit my scope to what is really generalizable. And that's okay, because the goal of knowing what's happening in the Canadian context is useful and necessary, and really helps us build theories about why people support or don't support electoral reform. For a lot of policymakers in Canada, knowing what's going on in Canada in the specific Canadian context is really important. However, when I do quantitative work, I'm doing this experimental study to know if people get this information, are they more likely to support it? There might be more generalizability, and that's what I'm aiming to do in the research. I would assume that people in New Zealand aren't that much different than people in Ontario, and so I could say, presented with similar, I could do the same experiment over there, and I would suspect that the people would respond in the same sort of way. The people who get the information are more likely to support it than the people who don't. So if I add in another case, in this case I'm looking at individuals, so if I add in another individuals or another group of individuals, it's probably not going to be a big deal. I mean, if I add in one more individual and everything changes, that's usually a good sign that I'm not doing something correctly in my quantitative work. However, if in a qualitative study, maybe tomorrow Alberta suddenly had a referendum, maybe there's other factors that would look different, and I'd have to consider whether the theories that I built from previous referenda really made sense for that new case, and that's a good thing. That actually also contributes. So there's differences in how you can generalize and the scope of what you're going to be studying. So relatedly, there's going to be differences in how you're choosing cases. So essentially, generally qualitative researchers will start by selecting cases, it says right here, where the outcome of interest occurs. So in my example, I picked the provinces that had a referendum. It would be really boring if I was like, well, there was no referendum in Manitoba, and because there was no referendum, there was no electoral reform. Cool. Okay, that doesn't really tell me much. So I am going to pick the interesting cases, the BC and Ontario and Prince Edward Island, those provinces that had referendums. Whereas in my quantitative work, if I just picked all supporters of electoral reform to do the study, that really wouldn't be super helpful for me understanding the real impact of knowledge. I want a lot of observations here. The more the merrier in general, if you can afford it at least. And I'm dealing, in this quantitative work with hundreds of individuals. So I'm not just going to pick those who reject electoral reform or support it, because then that really doesn't tell me that my intervention, so knowledge or information, it doesn't really tell me what that does. I actually really want to have both types of people in there. I don't want to assume what their outcome is before that I choose them to take part in the study. Ideally, I want to have both. And so that case selection is going to be quite different than in your quantitative and qualitative, about who you're picking, not just the number of people you're picking or number of cases you're picking. All right, weighting. So that's going to be another difference that you might see between qualitative and quantitative work. essentially how much weight you provide to any particular case. And in some cases, I really like where it says here that a qualitative research will say, well, given my prior theoretical beliefs, how much does this observation affect these beliefs? And so in this case, a single piece of data can really affect your beliefs. There can be crucial data. Whereas a quantitative scholar, as it says here, is not going to really make assumptions about whether one particular observation is going to count more than others. So, for example, in qualitative work on electoral reform, something like British Columbia, where they would have passed had it not been for the threshold that was higher than 50%, that's quite important. That's something that needs to be considered, and I might weight that a little bit more. Whereas in my experiment of individuals, everyone is weighted the same. It would actually be really weird if I based my findings on just some random outliner who thought democracy was the most terrible thing in the world and hated elections. That would be really strange. It would not help me to understand what was going on by basing it on this outlier. Whereas, again, in the Qual, this outlier, well, it didn't end up being an outlier, but this case where it did end up getting a majority, but not the supermajority, is really important and really worthwhile. And that relates really well to point 8, which is that there are going to be substantively important cases. Maybe what happened in BC was more important because it set the tone for subsequent referenda. Maybe knowing what happened the first time is just more important. Or perhaps maybe British Columbia was a most likely case. There had been a wrong winner election, there was more progressive beliefs and opinions maybe. They often say it's like the Sinatra most likely case theory, so if you can make it there, it'll make it anywhere type thing in certain cases where, it wasn't going to happen. So it can be actually important, whereas in quantitative research, one person is one person and doesn't really matter more than others within your statistical analysis. All right. So moving on to number 9 is lack of fit. So essentially, what do you do if a factor doesn't work, or if something doesn't seem to make sense? So if a factor doesn't seem to fit or work, the qualitative researcher will dig a bit deeper. So I might dig a little deeper into why thresholds existed in British Columbia. That's quite important. It might say something really important about why it failed. On the other hand, in quantitative research, if one particular person doesn't have that intended effect from the information, so if they get this information about electoral reform and they still reject the proposal, one person doing that doesn't really matter. In general, when we're doing regression or statistical analysis, we include an error term for all that messiness and all of that, messiness that is humans. And again, one person really isn't going to make a huge, big difference. And so essentially, oftentimes we will, just say, yeah, the error exists and move on. Whereas, a qualitative researcher might say, okay, that error term or that error that seems to exist and not fit, I really want to dig into this, as opposed to just chalk it up to the fact that there's going to be some error in the social world. And then the last one is looking at concepts and measurement. And concepts and measuring them are key in both. Both types of scholars are going to have to do concepts and measures. One might say, though, that a qualitative researcher might see as a concept of more key. So, for example, what do we really mean by education? What do we really mean by political will? Those are some concepts that we really have to nail down pretty firmly in order to do our qualitative study of electoral reform. But in the quantitative study, we do the same thing. We really want to nail down what our concept is, but we spend a lot of time also looking at measurements. So in our experimental work, we spent a lot of time developing what is that treatment, what is that information they're getting going to look like. Also, how are we going to measure knowledge and education? So is it a battery of questions about the proposal, but that might not actually show integrated knowledge or understanding? So maybe we want to know how much are they able to understand what the referendum is going to mean to them, and then that's going to be the way that we want to measure. So looking at our battery of questions we're going to ask to try to tease out that measurement of what is knowledge and understanding is really key when you're doing this quantitative work, though of course concepts and measures are important for both. So in sum, you can see that in the example I gave today, we're really trying to tap into the same puzzle, but we're approaching it in two different ways. And there's not one that is better and one that is worse, but they're each able to contribute something unique. I'd say the qualitative case study is really able to capture what's going on in this Canadian context that has led to electoral reform being something that just never makes it through. And that's really interesting and really important for policymakers, and really helps us to develop that theory about the role of political will, or the role of education in public deliberation. The quantitative work was a little more specific. It was going specifically into this relationship between knowledge and support for a referendum, and was trying to generalize, okay, is there something that we can say more generalizable here about that relationship between what somebody knows and whether they're likely to support it? And in my experience, I started with the qualitative work. I started with this work that was, well, why did it fail? I noticed that these were failing. And then because of that qualitative work, I wanted to pinpoint more specifically the impact of education, because everyone seemed to be pointing to this idea that education is that thing that needs to happen if you want a referendum to succeed. And so the quantitative work then was able to actually delve a bit deeper into that particular causal mechanism. So both are important, both contribute to our understanding. And that's why, even though they are two cultures, they are both necessary and important for us as social scientists.